The morning mist still clung to the grounds of Highgrove House when Detective Sergeant Marcus Thompson received the call that would change everything. A Royal Protection Officer named James Mitchell had filed a lawsuit against Tom Parker Bowles, the stepson of Queen Camilla. The allegations were serious enough to send shockwaves through the royal household and beyond. James Mitchell had served the royal family faithfully for 15 years. His record was spotless, his loyalty unquestioned, and his dedication absolute. He had protected members of the royal family through countless public engagements, private functions, and delicate situations that never made it to the newspapers. But now this decorated officer was making claims that threatened to tear apart the carefully maintained facade of royal propriety. The lawsuit centered around a business deal gone wrong. According to Mitchell's legal filing, Tom Parker Bowles had approached him 18 months earlier with what seemed like an incredible opportunity. Tom claimed he was launching a luxury food consultancy firm that would cater to high-profile clients around the world. He needed investors, and he specifically targeted royal staff members, knowing they had both savings and a deep sense of trust in the family they served. Mitchell had been hesitant at first. His salary as a protection officer was decent but not extraordinary, and the $50,000 Tom was asking for represented nearly 2 years of his savings. However, Tom had been persuasive, charming, and most importantly, he had used his mother's position and the royal connection as implicit guarantees of the venture's legitimacy. The food critic had painted a picture of exclusive contracts with Michelin-starred restaurants, celebrity endorsements, and international expansion opportunities. He showed Mitchell glossy brochures, professional presentations, and even claimed to have meetings lined up with potential clients from the entertainment industry. The business seemed solid, the returns promised were reasonable rather than fantastical, and Tom's reputation in the culinary world added credibility to the venture. What convinced Mitchell to invest wasn't just the business plan, but the personal touch Tom had added. He invited Mitchell and his wife to dinner at his home, introduced them to his circle of friends, and treated them like family rather than employees. For a man who spent his days maintaining professional distance while protecting royals, this warmth was both unexpected and appreciated. Mitchell had witnessed Tom's success as a food writer and television personality. He had seen the respect Tom commanded in culinary circles, and the way doors opened for him because of his expertise and connections. The investment opportunity seemed like a chance to be part of something bigger, something that could secure Mitchell's family's financial future. The protection officer had done his due diligence as best he could. He researched the food consultancy industry, looked into Tom's previous business ventures, and even consulted with a financial advisor. Everything seemed legitimate, and the advisor had noted that having a royal connection, even indirectly, would likely be beneficial for such a business. When Mitchell finally agreed to invest, Tom had been effusive in his gratitude. He promised regular updates, quarterly reports, and assured Mitchell that his money would be treated with the same care Tom would show his own family's investments. They shook hands in Tom's study, surrounded by cookbooks and photographs from his various television appearances, and Mitchell felt confident he was making the right decision. For the first few months, everything seemed to be progressing well. Tom provided regular updates about client meetings, contract negotiations, and business development. He spoke enthusiastically about partnerships being formed and revenue streams being established. Mitchell felt vindicated in his decision and even began to consider making an additional investment when Tom mentioned expansion opportunities. However, as time passed, the updates became less frequent and more vague. Tom's explanations for delays grew more elaborate, always involving external factors beyond his control. Clients were taking longer to make decisions. Contracts were being held up by legal technicalities, and economic conditions were affecting the luxury market more than anticipated. Mitchell's first real concern arose when he asked to see financial statements for the business. Tom provided documents, but they seemed incomplete and didn't match the optimistic reports he had been giving verbally. When Mitchell pressed for more detailed information, Tom became defensive, suggesting that Mitchell didn't understand the complexities of running a high-end consultancy business. The breaking point came when Mitchell discovered that the business address Tom had provided was actually a mail forwarding service, and several of the client references Tom had mentioned either didn't exist or had never heard of the consultancy firm. Mitchell realized he might have been deceived by someone he had trusted implicitly because of their family connection to the woman who would become queen. As Mitchell prepared to take legal action, he knew he was crossing a line that could end his career and potentially expose him to retaliation. But his sense of justice and the financial devastation he faced left him with no choice but to pursue the truth, regardless of the consequences. The news of the lawsuit broke like a thunderclap across the British media landscape. Within hours of the court filing becoming public, journalists were scrambling to piece together the details of what appeared to be the most damaging scandal to hit the royal family since the phone hacking controversies. The palace press office went into crisis mode, but their usual strategies of dignified silence and measured responses seemed inadequate for the explosive nature of Mitchell's allegations. Tom Parker Bowles found himself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight that was far different from his usual media appearances, discussing food in restaurants. Photographers camped outside his London home. Reporters shouted questions as he tried to go about his daily routine, and social media exploded with speculation and commentary. The man who had built his career on his expertise with fine cuisine was now facing questions about his business ethics and personal integrity. The legal team representing Tom was among London's finest, specialists in high-profile cases involving public figures. They immediately went on the offensive, characterizing Mitchell's lawsuit as a desperate attempt by a disgruntled former employee to extract money from the royal family through false allegations. They pointed to Mitchell's long service record and suggested that financial pressures in his personal life might have motivated him to fabricate the fraud claims. However, Mitchell's legal representation was equally formidable. His solicitor, Sarah Henderson, was known for her meticulous preparation and her ability to navigate complex financial fraud cases. She had taken on Mitchell's case after reviewing the evidence he had gathered, and she was convinced that her client had been the victim of a sophisticated deception that exploited his trust and loyalty to the royal family. The preliminary hearings revealed disturbing details about the alleged fraud scheme. Mitchell's legal team presented evidence suggesting that Tom had created an elaborate fiction around his consultancy business. Bank records showed that the majority of Mitchell's investment had not been used for business purposes but had instead been diverted to Tom's personal accounts and used to fund his lifestyle rather than generate the promised returns. More damaging still were the communications that Mitchell had meticulously preserved. Text messages and emails from Tom painted a picture of someone who was either deliberately misleading investors or was so detached from reality that he genuinely believed his own false promises. The messages showed Tom making increasingly desperate attempts to explain delays and setbacks while continuing to ask for additional investments from Mitchell and others. The court learned that Mitchell was not Tom's only victim. 3 other royal staff members had also invested in the consultancy firm, though none had lost as much money as Mitchell. These individuals were reluctant to come forward publicly, fearing for their jobs and concerned about the potential repercussions of challenging someone so closely connected to the royal family. Tom's defense team argued that the business venture was legitimate but had failed due to market conditions and circumstances beyond their client's control. They maintained that Tom had acted in good faith throughout and had genuinely believed the business would succeed. They presented character witnesses who testified to Tom's reputation in the food industry and his previous successful business ventures. However, the prosecution's case was strengthened by forensic accountants who had analyzed the financial records of Tom's consultancy firm. Their analysis revealed a pattern of financial mismanagement that went beyond simple business failure and suggested deliberate misrepresentation of the company's status and prospects. Money that should have been held in business accounts had been transferred to personal accounts, and expenses claimed as business costs included luxury purchases that had no connection to the consultancy's operations. The media coverage intensified as more details emerged from the court proceedings. Royal commentators debated whether Tom's alleged actions would affect his mother's position as queen consort, and constitutional experts discussed the precedent of criminal proceedings involving someone so closely connected to the monarch. The palace maintained its official silence, but sources close to the royal household suggested that senior royals were deeply concerned about the potential damage to the institution's reputation. Mitchell's personal story became a focal point of public sympathy. Here was a man who had dedicated his career to protecting the royal family, only to allegedly be deceived by someone within the extended royal circle. His financial losses were devastating for someone on a public servant's salary, and the emotional toll of pursuing justice against such powerful adversaries was evident in his court appearances. The case also highlighted broader questions about the business activities of royal family members and their associates. Critics argued that Tom had used his royal connections inappropriately to gain the trust of potential investors, while supporters maintained that his business relationships should be judged independently of his family connections. As the legal proceedings continued, it became clear that this was more than just a civil dispute over a failed business venture. The case was evolving into a test of whether royal connections could shield someone from accountability for their actions, and whether ordinary people like Mitchell could successfully challenge the powerful when they believed they had been wronged. The stakes were rising for everyone involved. The courthouse atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the trial entered its most critical phase. James Mitchell took the witness stand with the bearing of a man who had spent years in high-pressure situations, but the weight of challenging someone connected to the royal family was clearly taking its toll. His testimony would prove to be the turning point that transformed a civil lawsuit into something far more damaging for Tom Parker Bowles and, by extension, the royal family itself. Under direct examination, Mitchell methodically laid out his case. He described how Tom had specifically targeted royal staff members for investment, knowing they would be more likely to trust someone connected to Queen Camilla. Mitchell revealed that Tom had made explicit references to his mother's position during their initial meetings, suggesting that royal connections would help the business succeed with high-profile clients. The most damaging testimony came when Mitchell described a dinner party at Tom's home where other potential investors were present. According to Mitchell, Tom had implied that members of the royal family were aware of and supportive of his business venture. He had shown guests photographs of himself with various royals and suggested that these relationships would translate into business opportunities for the consultancy firm. However, it was during cross-examination that the real bombshell emerged. Tom's defense attorney, attempting to discredit Mitchell's account, pressed him about his motivations for pursuing the lawsuit. The questioning became aggressive, suggesting that Mitchell was fabricating evidence to extract money from the royal family. This approach backfired spectacularly when Mitchell, clearly frustrated by the accusations, revealed information he had previously withheld. Mitchell testified that during one of their final meetings, when he was pressing Tom for information about his missing investment, Tom had become agitated and made statements that went far beyond the business fraud. In a moment of apparent panic, Tom had confessed to Mitchell that the failed business was just one of several financial problems he was facing. More shocking still, Tom had revealed that he had been using his royal connections to facilitate other questionable activities. The courtroom fell silent as Mitchell described how Tom had admitted to using his access to royal events and functions to gather information that he then sold to tabloid journalists. Tom had allegedly been providing details about private royal conversations, family disputes, and personal information about working royals to newspapers in exchange for substantial payments. This revelation transformed the case from a simple fraud lawsuit into a matter of national security and royal privacy. Mitchell's testimony became even more explosive when he revealed that Tom had shown him bank statements proving these payments from media outlets. The amounts were significant, sometimes reaching 5 figures for particularly sensitive information. Tom had apparently been operating as an informal royal correspondent, using his family position to access information that would never be available to ordinary journalists. The defense team immediately objected to this testimony, arguing that it was beyond the scope of the fraud case and should be excluded. However, Mitchell's attorney successfully argued that Tom's confession to Mitchell was directly relevant to understanding his financial situation and his motivations for the alleged fraud. The judge allowed the testimony to continue, much to the visible dismay of Tom's legal team. Mitchell went on to describe how Tom had detailed his methods for gathering and selling royal information. He would attend family gatherings and social events, making mental notes of conversations and observations that he could later monetize. He had developed relationships with several tabloid journalists who were eager to pay for authentic insider information about the royal family's private lives. The revelation that Tom had been essentially spying on his own family for profit sent shockwaves through the courtroom, and when the news broke across the entire country, royal commentators struggled to find historical precedents for such a betrayal of family trust from within the royal circle. The implications for royal security and privacy were enormous, and questions immediately arose about how long this had been going on and what information Tom might have shared. Mitchell's testimony also revealed that Tom had tried to recruit him into this information-selling scheme. Tom had suggested that Mitchell, with his access to royal security arrangements and private family moments, could provide even more valuable intelligence to the media. Mitchell had refused, but Tom had persisted, even offering to share the profits if Mitchell would provide information about the security protocols protecting Queen Camilla and other family members. The prosecution introduced evidence supporting Mitchell's claims, including phone records showing frequent contact between Tom and known tabloid journalists, and financial records indicating regular payments from media companies that couldn't be explained by Tom's legitimate work as a food critic. Bank deposits often coincided with major royal news stories, suggesting a clear connection between Tom's information-selling activities and media coverage. Tom's defense team was clearly caught off guard by these revelations. Their client had not informed them about his media dealings, and they were forced to request a recess to consult with their client about these new allegations. The damage, however, was already done. The fraud case had evolved into something much more serious, with implications that extended far beyond the money Mitchell had lost. The royal family's worst fears were being realized in the most public forum possible. Not only was there a family member facing fraud allegations, but now there were suggestions of systematic betrayal of royal privacy for financial gain. The palace's policy of remaining silent about the proceedings was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, as the scandal expanded beyond anything they had anticipated when the lawsuit was first filed. The revelation of Tom's alleged information-selling activities triggered an immediate crisis response from multiple institutions. Scotland Yard launched a criminal investigation into potential breaches of the Official Secrets Act, while the palace security team began an urgent review of all protocols and access arrangements. The case was no longer just about fraud. It had become a matter of national security and royal protection. Tom Parker Bowles, clearly unprepared for the direction the case had taken, made a critical decision that would ultimately seal his fate. Against the advice of his legal team, he chose to take the witness stand in his own defense. His lawyers had strongly recommended against this strategy, knowing that the prosecution would have the opportunity to cross-examine him about both the fraud allegations and the new claims about selling royal information. Tom's testimony began as an attempt to portray himself as a victim of circumstances rather than a perpetrator of fraud. He claimed that his business venture had been legitimate, and that its failure was due to market conditions and the economic impact of global events on the luxury consulting industry. He acknowledged that he had been overly optimistic in his projections, but insisted that he had genuinely believed the business would succeed. However, when the prosecution began their cross-examination, Tom's carefully constructed defense began to crumble. The lead prosecutor, armed with the evidence Mitchell had provided and additional information uncovered during the investigation, systematically dismantled Tom's claims about his business activities. Bank records showed that very little of the investors' money had actually been used for legitimate business purposes. The prosecutor presented evidence of luxury purchases, expensive holidays, and personal expenditures that had been funded with money supposedly invested in the consultancy business. Tom struggled to explain how a business trip to Paris had included charges for designer clothing and fine dining that bore no relation to any potential clients or business meetings. His explanations became increasingly implausible as more evidence was presented. The most devastating moment came when the prosecutor confronted Tom directly about his alleged media activities. Tom initially denied selling any information about the royal family, claiming that his relationship with journalists was purely professional and related to his food writing career. However, the prosecution produced phone records, email communications, and financial transactions that painted a very different picture. Under intense questioning, Tom's composure finally broke. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of perjury charges if he continued to deny the allegations, Tom admitted that he had occasionally provided information to journalists about royal family matters. His initial confession was tentative, describing his actions as casual conversations rather than deliberate information selling. However, as the prosecutor pressed further, Tom's admissions became more extensive and damaging. He acknowledged that he had received payments for information, but claimed they were modest amounts for harmless details about family gatherings and social events. The prosecution quickly demolished this characterization by presenting evidence of substantial payments and sensitive information that had clearly compromised royal privacy and security. Tom's testimony revealed the extent of his betrayal of family trust. He admitted to recording conversations at family gatherings using his phone, taking photographs of private documents when visiting royal residences, and even sharing details about his mother's health concerns and personal relationships with tabloid journalists. The information he had sold included advance notice of royal engagements, details about family disagreements, and personal information about working royals' private lives. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Tom described how he had rationalized his actions to himself. He claimed that he needed the money to maintain his lifestyle and support his business ventures. He suggested that the royal family's wealth meant they wouldn't be significantly harmed by the disclosure of private information, while he desperately needed the income to avoid financial ruin. Perhaps most shockingly, Tom revealed that he had been selling royal information for over 3 years, long before he had approached Mitchell and others with his fraudulent investment scheme. The media payments had initially helped him maintain his lifestyle, but as his spending increased and his legitimate income sources became insufficient, he had turned to the investment fraud as another way of extracting money from people who trusted him because of his royal connections. Tom's testimony also revealed that he had considered the royal staff members ideal targets for fraud, because he knew they would be reluctant to pursue legal action against someone connected to the family they served. He had calculated that their loyalty and discretion would protect him from accountability, and he had been genuinely surprised when Mitchell had chosen to file the lawsuit rather than simply accept the loss. The prosecution introduced evidence showing that Tom had researched the financial situations of various royal staff members before approaching them with investment opportunities. He had specifically targeted those who had savings but limited investment experience, knowing they would be more likely to trust his recommendations and less likely to conduct thorough due diligence on his business claims. As Tom's testimony continued, it became clear that his actions had been far more calculated and extensive than anyone had initially realized. He had systematically exploited his royal connections for financial gain, while simultaneously betraying the trust of the family that had welcomed him into their inner circle. His admissions in court had effectively ended any possibility of maintaining his position within royal circles, and had potentially exposed him to serious criminal charges. The defense team's strategy lay in ruins. Their client had not only confirmed the fraud allegations but had also admitted to years of systematic betrayal of royal privacy. The case they had initially approached as a straightforward civil dispute had become a public relations disaster and a potential criminal matter that could result in imprisonment rather than just financial penalties. The final days of the trial unfolded against a backdrop of unprecedented media scrutiny and public fascination. Tom's explosive testimony had transformed what began as a relatively obscure fraud case into one of the most significant royal scandals in modern British history. News outlets across the globe picked up the story, and constitutional experts debated the implications of such systematic betrayal from within the extended royal family. The prosecution's closing arguments painted a damning picture of Tom Parker Bowles as a man who had ruthlessly exploited every advantage his royal connections provided. They described a pattern of behavior that went far beyond simple financial desperation and revealed a calculated willingness to betray family trust for personal gain. The prosecutor emphasized that Tom's actions had not only harmed individual investors like Mitchell but had also compromised the security and privacy of the entire royal family. Evidence presented during the closing arguments showed that Tom's information selling activities had directly led to several embarrassing news stories about the royal family. Private conversations had been twisted into sensational headlines, Family disagreements had been magnified into public controversies, and personal struggles had been exposed for public consumption. The prosecutor argued that Tom had essentially weaponized his family relationships for profit, showing complete disregard for the consequences of his actions. The defense team faced an almost impossible task in their closing arguments. Tom's admissions from the witness stand had effectively confirmed most of the prosecution's case, leaving his lawyers with little room for maneuver. They attempted to portray their client as a man driven to desperate measures by financial pressures and personal struggles, arguing that his actions, while inexcusable, stemmed from circumstances rather than malicious intent. However, the defense's arguments fell flat when confronted with the systematic nature of Tom's activities. The evidence showed that his information selling had begun during a period when he was financially stable, suggesting that greed rather than necessity had been his primary motivation. His targeting of loyal royal staff members for the investment fraud demonstrated a level of calculation that undermined any claims of desperation-driven behavior. Judge Harrison, presiding over the case, delivered a verdict that would resonate far beyond the courtroom. He found Tom Parker Bowles liable for fraud in the amount of $50,000 plus damages and legal costs, effectively confirming that Mitchell's investment had been obtained through deliberate misrepresentation. However, the judge's comments during sentencing addressed the broader implications of the case and Tom's admitted betrayals of royal privacy. Judge Harrison noted that while the court's jurisdiction was limited to the civil fraud case, Tom's admissions during testimony had revealed activities that were potentially far more serious than the original allegations. He observed that the systematic selling of private royal information raised questions about national security and the integrity of the institutions that protect the monarchy. The judge recommended that the appropriate authorities pursue criminal investigations into these activities. The immediate aftermath of the verdict saw Tom's world collapse around him. Within hours of the judgment, several major media outlets announced that they were suspending their relationships with Tom and canceling his contracts. Television producers pulled his shows from upcoming schedules, and publishers began reviewing their agreements for his food writing and cookbook deals. His career in the media industry, built over many years, evaporated virtually overnight. More devastating still was the response from the royal family itself. While the palace maintained its official policy of not commenting on the legal proceedings, sources close to the royal household made it clear that Tom was no longer welcome at royal events and gatherings. His access to royal residences was immediately revoked, and security protocols were amended to ensure he could not exploit his family connections in the future. Queen Camilla faced an impossible situation. The actions of her son had not only embarrassed the royal family but had also potentially compromised her own position and the security of the entire institution. Palace insiders suggested that she was devastated by Tom's betrayals and was struggling to reconcile her love for her son with the damage his actions had caused to the monarchy she had sworn to serve. The criminal investigation launched by Scotland Yard moved swiftly in the wake of Tom's court admissions. Detectives specialized in national security matters began examining the full extent of his information selling activities and assessing whether any of the disclosed information had compromised royal security or endangered family members. The investigation also sought to identify all the media outlets that had purchased information from Tom and the specific details that had been sold. For James Mitchell, the verdict represented a form of vindication, though the financial compensation could never fully restore what he had lost. Beyond the money, Mitchell had suffered significant damage to his career prospects and personal reputation. His decision to pursue the lawsuit had required tremendous courage, knowing that he was challenging someone with powerful connections and risking his own future in royal protection services. Mitchell's victory in court also highlighted broader issues about the vulnerability of public servants who place their trust in people connected to the institutions they serve. His case demonstrated that loyalty and service could be exploited by those willing to abuse positions of privilege and trust. The royal household was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about how such exploitation had been allowed to continue for years without detection. The media landscape also faced scrutiny following the revelations about Tom's information-selling activities. Questions arose about editorial standards and the ethics of purchasing private information from family members of public figures. Several newspapers were forced to review their practices and explain their relationships with sources who had access to private royal information through family connections. As the immediate shock of the verdict began to settle, it became clear that the case had fundamentally altered the relationship between the royal family and the media, changed security protocols around royal access, and demonstrated that even the most privileged individuals could face accountability when their actions crossed legal and ethical boundaries. 6 months after the verdict that had shaken the British monarchy to its core, the full consequences of Tom Parker Bowles's betrayals were still unfolding across multiple institutions and individual lives. The man who had once enjoyed privileged access to the highest levels of British society found himself completely ostracized, his royal future permanently severed, and facing the prospect of criminal prosecution that could result in imprisonment. Scotland Yard's investigation had expanded far beyond the initial scope, revealing that Tom's information-selling network was more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Detectives discovered that he had provided sensitive information to foreign media outlets, potentially compromising national security interests. The investigation revealed contacts with journalists from countries whose governments had complex relationships with the United Kingdom, raising concerns about whether royal family information had been used for purposes beyond mere tabloid gossip. The criminal charges filed against Tom were severe and wide-ranging. Beyond the fraud conviction from the civil case, he now faced charges under the Official Secrets Act, computer misuse violations for secretly recording conversations, and conspiracy charges related to his systematic information-selling activities. Legal experts suggested that if convicted on all charges, Tom could face up to 10 years in prison, a sentence that would effectively end any remaining hopes of rehabilitation or return to public life. Perhaps most devastating for Tom was the complete breakdown of his relationship with his mother, Queen Camilla. Palace sources revealed that the Queen consort had not spoken to her son since his court admissions and had instructed her staff to redirect all his attempts at communication. The woman who had once been his strongest supporter and advocate within the royal family now viewed him as a fundamental threat to the institution she had pledged to serve and protect. The impact on Queen Camilla's own position within the royal family was profound and ongoing. While King Charles had publicly supported his wife throughout the crisis, constitutional experts noted that the scandal had damaged her credibility and raised questions about her judgment in family matters. Some Republican critics used the scandal to argue that the monarchy's extended family posed inherent security risks that the institution could not adequately manage. James Mitchell's victory in court had come at a significant personal cost that extended far beyond the financial losses he had initially suffered. His career in royal protection services was effectively over, as the controversy surrounding the case made it impossible for him to continue in his role. Despite being vindicated in court, Mitchell found himself viewed with suspicion by some colleagues who felt he should have handled the situation through internal channels rather than public litigation. However, Mitchell's courage in pursuing the case had also earned him unexpected support and opportunities. Several private security firms had approached him with job offers, recognizing that his willingness to stand up to powerful interests demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity they wanted in their organizations. A prominent victims' rights organization had also offered him a position helping other individuals who had been defrauded by people in positions of trust. The royal household implemented sweeping changes to prevent future security breaches and betrayals of trust. New protocols required comprehensive background checks for anyone granted access to royal events or residences, regardless of their family connections. Electronic devices were banned from private royal gatherings, and staff members received enhanced training on identifying and reporting potential security threats from within the extended royal circle. The media industry faced its own reckoning in the aftermath of Tom's revelations. Several major newspapers were forced to admit that they had purchased information from him over the years, leading to internal investigations and policy changes regarding the acquisition of private information about public figures. The Press Complaints Commission launched a review of industry standards and recommended new ethical guidelines for dealing with sources who had family or personal connections to their subjects. Tom's former media career lay in complete ruins, with no prospect of rehabilitation. His television shows had been permanently canceled, his restaurant reviews were no longer published, and his planned cookbook projects had been abandoned by publishers. The food industry, which had once embraced him as an expert and celebrity, now viewed him as a liability whose association could damage reputations and business relationships. The financial consequences for Tom were equally severe. Beyond the fraud judgment requiring him to repay Mitchell with interest and damages, Tom faced massive legal bills from both the civil and criminal proceedings. His assets were frozen pending the outcome of the criminal trial, and civil lawsuits from other defrauded investors were being prepared. The lifestyle he had funded through his betrayals was no longer sustainable, and bankruptcy seemed inevitable. The broader royal family had closed ranks against Tom, making it clear that his actions had permanently severed his connection to the monarchy. His invitations to royal events were permanently revoked. His access to royal properties was terminated, and family members were instructed to maintain no contact with him. The man who had once been photographed at state dinners and royal celebrations was now completely excluded from the world he had exploited for profit. As Tom awaited his criminal trial, he found himself isolated and facing an uncertain future. The privileged life he had taken for granted was gone forever, replaced by the prospect of imprisonment and permanent exile from the circles where he had once moved freely. His betrayals had not only destroyed his own future, but had also inflicted lasting damage on the royal institution and the family members who had trusted him. The case of Tom Parker Bowles versus James Mitchell had evolved from a simple fraud lawsuit into a cautionary tale about the corrupting potential of privilege and access. It demonstrated that even those closest to power could face accountability when their actions crossed legal and ethical boundaries, and that institutions like the monarchy, despite their traditional protections, could not shield individuals who systematically betrayed the trust placed in them. Tom's royal future had indeed ended, not through external forces or changing times, but through his own calculated decisions to exploit the very relationships that had given him status and opportunity.